With immense pleasure, I extend with a delightful heart my welcome and greetings on behalf of all the institution members, faculty, students, and along with the other admin staff that is, of course, today engaged in lots of their administrative duties. Welcome, Salvatore Tolone, Professor Sal. Welcome back to our
Good
next.
morning. Good
Good morning.
afternoon
Good
to you.
morning. Yes, at our end it is very much good afternoon, proceeding towards evening, and at your end it is daytime.
Yeah. Here is 7 o'clock a.m.
Oh my God! So we always make you get up early.
Yes. No. It's a normal time for me. Thanks so much, doctor.
Thank you for joining in time and giving us a lot of inspiration by your gracious presence. Uh,
Thank
we
you very much.
we extend you welcome and a lot of greetings for the nice day to go ahead. Today, the August gathering for this online summit is to mark the commemoration of the International Human Rights Day 2021. It is a matter of great privilege and honor for the institution as well as for all the attendees world across to extend you greetings on this platform so that we all can with your kind discourse. I extend lots of in-depth thanks for such grace and healthy positive spirit to take this initiative by sharing your knowledge, experience, as well as your, the expression that you would give us, and not only to enrich our enthusiastic humane audience, but also to very much, the stakeholders, especially who are engaged in all sorts of activities across the world today. And our today's panel of speaker consists of four known honorable luminaries of intelligentsia and academia. Their journey to be human, to study about psyche of human, and to work for the subjectivity of human, and to ensure safety of human will be indeed illustrated through their discourses. So, first of all, I would like to introduce in today's luminary speakers the first youngest speaker, Mr. Sarthak Roy. He is LLM, that is Masters in Legal Expertise, and his forte is, of course, in very much in human rights, and especially he has also gone through his studies in while doing comparative studies with regard to global migration policies and intergovernmental, you may say, issues, especially in the South Asia, the countries which he has covered up. The spaces that he took up in his comparative studies were Bangladesh, India, and Sri Lanka. And he had also been associated with the professional bodies, Commonwealth Secretariat, Human Rights Council, and other states and civil societies. And one of the best accreditation that to be given to Sarthak Roy is that he's a very much the debater. He got awarded in the International Geneva Debate Competition in 2021 as the best debater. So I welcome Mr. Satyak Roy, the youngest speaker among all the four luminaries of today's discourse. Welcome, Sarthak. Will you share your
Thank you so
screen,
much.
Sarthak?
Yes, I'll be doing that.
Okay. So I'm switching off my screen.
Right. Just one second.
Even I can share from this side if you.
Right. I think that'll be a little easier because sometimes I might I'll just
It's
make
on
a
my
mistake.
desktop. I can easily share. Just wait.
Sure, that'll be better.
Sorry. Wait. Stop sharing.
Right. Okay, so when I proceed on to the next slide, I will just give a notification to you to just go on to the next slide. So firstly, thank you very much, Dr. Jayshree Singh, and to the Bhopal Nobles University for giving me this opportunity as a young um, out of law school and just with some limited work experience, this great opportunity of presenting amongst an esteemed panel of experts and scholars as well as practitioners that I have around us. So now to begin with, I want to set out the space by outlining, most importantly, as to how India has contributed towards the growth of international human rights. This stems from the fact from my personal experience as well during my law school days in India, as well as those in Geneva, that human rights is some sort of a very Western concept, and where India had to take part not directly but indirectly. But then through my research and through other readings, I must say that India very much contributed towards this modern idea of international human rights that we see in the two main covenants of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the ICCPR, or the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So, as we know, for all the students who are watching, this is a very iconic picture that is there on the first slide. Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, who was the sister of Jawaharlal Nehru and was the first ever Asian woman to be the president of the UNGA and played a very stellar role in leading India's march at the UN on various issues, primarily on human rights issues. And Mr. Dag Hammarskjöld was a former UN Secretary General, a person of great repute, especially in trying to resolve the Katangese war between in Congo during the whole rebellion that happened. And unfortunately, he lost his life in a plane crash under mysterious circumstances. But then this is a very important picture to begin our conversations today. Next slide, please.
Yeah, just wait.
Right.
Can you see?
So, yes, I can see. So, as I mentioned, so India's contribution stems not just from modernity, but from time immemorial in our civilizational values. India always has had its bent towards upholding various forms of human rights, which we see in the present form today. So, in a nutshell, it can be said that thanks to our civilizational values and our civilizational ethos, India has propagated and upheld a lot of human rights and humanism in its projects as well as international diplomacy throughout the years. So, as we move on to the next slide, please let me just tell you as to how, in our great thinkers like Manu and Gautam Buddha, as well as in various religious texts itself, we find various ideas of human rights and human freedoms. As you can see, freedom from violence, which is very famously known as ahimsa, which was practiced and propagated by Gandhi, and freedom from want, freedom from exploitation, freedom from violation or dishonor, and freedom for early death or disease. These are some of the very five social freedoms which are outlined in various religious scriptures like the Upanishads, the Puranas, and the Smritis in the from the Hindu texts. But now I'm not going to deal much into the religious aspects of things, but move on to the current context, whereby I highlight in little depth as to how during the World War, after the aftermath of the World War One, and prior to the creation of the United Nations, as we know as India's contribution that time also remained, despite not being an independent state or an entity in itself. So after the World War, it so happened that President after World War One, which witnessed a large-scale devastation and violations, we witnessed President Woodrow Wilson, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's ideas, which were outlined in the very famous 14 points that called for the self-determination of peoples and suggested that a general association of nations must be formed under specific covenants for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states. So, what has been the outcome of this Wilsonian 14 principles? The great outcome has been General Assembly resolutions like new international economic orders and the creation of the law of the sea regime, and many of the same from Woodrow Wilson. So, but then in the after, I'm not going to focus much in the League of Nations aspect, but now I move on to the crux of our issue, which is the UN, the modern United Nations as we know as. So as the UN was being discussed and debated, and the San Francisco conferences and other conferences that led up to it, it must be highlighted that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, whose picture I shared before earlier in my first slide, went on a very famous tour across the United States in the 1940s, for that matter. So over there, during those tour, Pandit embarked. Pandit Vijay Lakshmi Pandit expressed a lot of views which are being shared by Jawaharlal Nehru and Mahatma Gandhi to the world at large. So she was the envoy, or the beacon of humanism and humanitarianism that India wanted to propagate at the global stage, in conjunction with the creation of the United Nations. So some of the ideas that she promoted was as to how there is a requirement, freedom of all people from the world's oppressed and colonized people, that equality for all and a life free from all forms of discrimination was a prerequisite to a life of dignity and larger freedom, and that any global body like the United Nations should represent the people of all countries, large and small, equally at the same level without any discrimination. So it has to be noted that Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's lectures drew large crowds and included various civic leaders across the US society. And as a small anecdote, let me remind you, Vijay Lakshmi Pandit's and Gandhi's ideas, which he promoted and propagated, also influenced powerfully the African American leadership that some years later inspired the great Martin Luther King and his crusade for emancipation of Black people in the US. So it is quite a wonderful sort of a paradox as to how India's vision contributed towards the growth of human rights even in the United States, thanks to Martin Luther King. So now as we go on to the next slide, as you can see over here, you see Mr. Arcot Ramaswamy Mudaliar. He was one of India's primary drafters, primary contributors and delegate at the San Francisco conference, and later for other various human rights specific treaty drafting procedures as well. So he was also a very stellar personality who is not often remembered in the modern discourse of human rights, especially from the global South perspective, but his contributions should be highlighted. So right after India joined the UN, between the 1950s and 1960s for that matter, leading up to the UDHR, India made several contributions in the field of human rights. And I'll just briefly sketch out a few for our audience here. Most importantly, India pointed out and flagged out South Africa's racist apartheid regime, which was being very active in South Africa, and that led to a lot of violations of people over there, especially of Indian origin people and Indians who worked there. And that was one of the first instances where India showcased to the world its wonderful diplomacy by upholding the trump card of human rights for all. Similarly, India also brought to the forefront the economic development of the poor countries in Economic and Social Council when it was elected as the organ's first president. It is very important to note that that is how this idea of non-aligned movement also got India championing the cause of various countries from the global south who did not have much voice at the global stage or were sidelined intentionally by various powerful countries. And various Indian economists back then helped in the inception of the UN Economic Development Administration in 1949 to finance the growth in less developed countries. And this further paved the platform for the creation of the United Nations, very famous United Nations Development Program, or the UNDP, as we know at large right now. And most importantly, as we know, yesterday was the Genocide Prevention Day. It is very important to note here that the wartime horrors triggered India along with Cuba and Panama in 1946 to propose a draft resolution to declare genocide as an international crime. And that's how, after that, it laid the pathway for the creation of the Genocide Convention, a very powerful tool of holding states to account because of acts of genocide being perpetrated around the world. Very famously, recently, Myanmar, as many of us might know, was hauled to the International Court of Justice pursuant to this Genocide Convention by the state of Gambia, who brought it forward. And later, if from the 1960s, when the process of decolonization was being laid out, India being led at that time by a very famous Indian diplomat, Maharaj Krishna Rasgotre, led the whole process of decolonization by very actively championing the cause of various African and Asian countries for their right to be independent. And that has been a very crucial project that India propagated, and that led to India leading the non-aligned movement back then as one of its founding creators of this concept of non-aligned movement. So now brings me to the very important part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is in the next slide you will see. And it is to be noted that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights we know is one of the very founding principled and foundational documents for human rights that we know as. Although many a times many skeptics and criticisms are presented that it is a very Western concept, but here by putting some closer attention, I'll show as to how India's role, and for that matter global South countries' role, were very much important and pertinent in the creation of the UDHR. And during the drafting processes of the UDHR, let me tell you, the leading figures who were present were obviously Vijay Lakshmi Pandit, Hansa Mehta, M.R. Masani, and Mr. Arkot Mudaliar Ramaswamy. So these were the legendary figures that all of us, especially from India, should know about, because sadly not much is written or spoken about in the discourse that we have. But before we discuss the primary contributions, let me bring a very small anecdote leading up to the creation of the UDHR. So it so happened that the Director General of the newly created United Nations Education, Science and Cultural Organization, the UNESCO, Dr. Julian Huxley, circulated a memorandum and questionnaire to 150 eminent thinkers around the world. It was also sent to various Indian thinkers, although it was sent to Jawaharlal Nehru, but at that time he did not have much time to provide his ideas. But then Mahatma Gandhi made a very telling and important contribution. So it required opinions about human rights. What could be those fundamental human rights that a treaty can bring forward? And in this response from Mahatma Gandhi, which is very famous, that he wrote while traveling by train to Delhi, a fantastic idea which encapsulates the human rights and its corresponding obligations. And this is what he wrote, and I quote, "I learned from my illiterate but wise mother that all rights to be deserved and preserved came from a duty well done. Thus the very right to live accrues to us only when we do the duty of citizenship to the world. From this one fundamental statement, perhaps, it is easy enough to define the duties of man and woman and correlate every right to some corresponding duty to be first performed." So thus we can see that India, and obviously through Gandhi's ideals, showcase that human rights in itself does not exist in vacuum. There are also fundamental duties which human beings ought to perform for the fulfillment and the realization of these rights. Without duties, general duties that each and every human being should perform, there would not be any human right. And it was a very telling contribution of Mahatma Gandhi, which was taken into account during the drafting processes of the UDHR. Ma'am, can you go back to the slide where the previous slide, please? Yes. So now on various issues, no, the one after. Yes. I'll spend some time on this very fundamental 5 issues where India made a very important contribution. So initially, it was initially on the clause relating to Article 1, instead of all human beings, it was written all men. But it was thanks to Hansa Mehta, who pushed for the inclusion of all human beings. Since, and this is what she says, she did not like the wording all men or and should act towards one another like brothers, since she felt that this might be interpreted to exclude women and were clearly out of date. So at that time, India, and along with various other global South countries, pushed for the inclusion of human beings at large, not just men, in the terminology of Article 1, which now reads as all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They're endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And now, if we go to the second contribution, ma'am, can you remain on that slide, please? Yes, yeah, let it be here. So the next most important contribution was on the issue of non-discrimination, which was very important because India that time included this idea of color and political opinion as a criteria for non-discrimination, because previously these two terminologies were not involved, and that led to a lot of heated debate, because many a times it so happened that it was said that race itself included color. But then since, at that time, M.R. Masani mentioned that sometimes this can be conflated and specific protections ought to be offered. And thus it read finally as everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion. And this idea of political opinion was very much hesitated by the USSR because of the fact that prior to the creation of the United Nations, in the USSR for that matter, there were a lot of purges against people holding different political opinion. So it did face a lot of resistance from the USSR in the inclusion. But finally, thanks to the wonderful adept diplomacy being practiced, these two wordings were included. Next is the very important contribution on the issue of freedom of movement. Previously, it so happened that the freedom of movement did not include freedom of coming back to did not include freedom of movement within the country. It was only about expatriation, which was being included. But then it so happened that India's diplomats pushed for the fact that a right of freedom of movement should include a very expansive notion, and thus it read as everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, and number two, everyone has the right to leave any country including his own and to return to his country. So these are very important aspects of contributions in terms of freedom of movement. And then the issue of right to work, again, right to work also something India faced resistance from several Western nations, because there were a lot of impositions being placed on the work hours and the forms and the structures of working mechanisms being placed. However, in this quite a paradox to note that India did receive the support of the UK, and finally the fourfold aspect of right to work read as everyone has a right to work, free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against employment. And everyone has, without any discrimination, the right to equal pay for equal work. And number three was about just and equal and favorable remuneration commensurate to the level of work without any discrimination of any kind. So that is also something which India raised and put forward on its own accord, and later was supplemented by UK's assistance as well. And finally, this whole idea of secularism, which was a very heated debate, because previously it so happened it was the UDHR had a terminology as to how about God and nature, which had also sidelined the ideas of atheists or people who do not believe in God for that matter. And India, in their progressive outlook, very much brought forth that it should be inclusive of all people, irrespective of their belief or faith in God or not. And therefore, it was the final article of Article 1, final text of Article 1 included the word that they are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in the spirit of brotherhood, and remove the terminologies of God and nature, because that could have been used otherwise. So apart from this, there were other obviously contributions that India did make towards the UDHR, although not pertinently on its own accord, but on issues related to self-determination, the need to strike a balance between individualism and collective rights, the necessary tension between sovereignty and international cooperation, amongst several others. Now, as in the last, I'll just take 2-3 minutes more to finally conclude my presentation right now. So it so happened that after the UDHR, and thanks to the international spotlight that India was under to comply with human rights, ma'am, if you can go to the next slide, there were a lot of important domestic human rights legislations which were brought forth. Yes, as you can all see, some of those legislations I've highlighted here, like the Protection of Human Rights Act, the Right to Information Act, Forest Rights Act, Right to Education Act, and Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. Although I was personally very much involved and invested in the torture, in creation of a torture law, which is still in a limbo because India has not ratified the torture legislation, and therefore falls short of its ideals which it presented, not just at the UN, but also at the creation of the UDHR. But I guess this process for enacting laws on issues like torture is an incremental process, and a process in progress towards that. So now, since 2006, almost 4 times, and they have a lot of pledges which are very continuous. But equally, India faces a criticism now. India right now is also seen as a chronic fence sitter on key issues while opposing resolutions against specific countries. They were failing the hopes of playing a leadership role in the promotion of human rights. For example, although our various domestic courts, even the Supreme Court, has recognized the environment, a right to environment, of clean environment as a human right, India unfortunately abstained from its recent resolution, landmark resolution at the latest session of the Human Rights Council, which was a setback. And sometimes we can see that how India votes at the Human Rights Council is contrary to various court decisions that our stellar Supreme Court judges have put forth throughout the years. And therefore, finally, what we can hope in the final slide is that there is a progress. There's a lot of work to be done, because India's human rights record and human rights leadership has clearly declined, unfortunately, from the way it showcased its leadership at the initial years of the UN or UDHR. However, considering that India's ethos and civilization values existed, and it is not going anywhere, it is to us and to all us students and practitioners to bring this idea forward and to showcase that India can itself always remain as a champion for human rights, and especially be the voice for the voiceless. Thank you very much, everyone, for your patient hearing, and I look forward to the other discussions.
Thank you, Mr. Sarthak, for delivering such a nice discourse and elaborating upon not only the historical facts that how post-independent India contributed in its own way without gender biasness, as well as with all foresightedness in the making of the world, which may be full of equanimity, equity, and equality. But coincidentally, there are various instances of violative goals that still lingering on to make the world in a bad shape. Although calamities are there, but still Human Rights Council at its own level, with the help of United Nations organization and with the other countries' contribution, making its best. But I would like, Sarthak, could you just a little bit highlight on the challenges ahead with regard to India's contribution, because somewhere you have missed one of your slides, and we want 1 minute of yours to focus on that slide, so that the audience who missed you, they can understand what were the challenges ahead for India, especially in the creating more better environment, or better environment for all people of the
Thank you,
world.
ma'am. Yes, I'll just give a small, take 2 minutes to clarify for that matter. So what we see is world right now is not multipolar, but mostly unipolar, and there is not much of multilateralism that happens. There is a lot of growth of soft law because of the fact that hard laws do not get formulated due to a lot of political considerations of states. So in this, we face a world where there is racism, there is populism, there is fascism, and there is a growth. There's the dangers of climate change. We have a pandemic ongoing around us. But my idea is very simple: that when India gained its independence and when India championed the cause of human rights, the situation back then was also not too simple either. India was a broken economy. India was a new country. It had just been divided on the lines of religion, and the world that time had recently faced a devastating Second World War. But so when we have parallels there, and we can equally just juxtapose the examples of the leadership that India showcased then, and India should not be lacking right now. There remains hope because India has championed the International Solar Alliance cause, for that matter, which brings together countries which are conscious of climate change and to bring alternative solar energy, for that matter. And we know that climate change and human rights are very intrinsically linked to one another. So that has been something which we can take an example from in terms of India. And apart from that, we know that India's volatile borders are very much dangerous because of certain neighbors who do not want the well-being. But then it has always been the case previously as well. So the situation, as stark as it is not new. It has happened before, and India can take its examples from our constitutional drafters, from our leaders, and our principled diplomats who have served in their stellar manner at the United Nations throughout the years. And that is why I remain hopeful that India will remain as a flag bearer of human rights and humanity at the international platform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarthak. Yes, our next speaker is Mr. Shabarinath Nair. Shabari, are you there? Available? Mr. Shabari?
I'm here,
Shabari
Jayshree.
Nair? Yeah, I'll just introduce you to our audience. Mr. Shabarinath Nair recently has taken up the position of Labor Migration Specialist for South Asia based in the International Labour Organization, Decent Work, a technical support team in New Delhi. He provides technical advisory services to 7 countries in the subcontinent region, of course, in its neighboring areas also: Bangladesh, Afghanistan, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. And before joining the Decent Work team, he was leading International Labour Organization's work on global migration policy, including for the intergovernmental negotiations and adoption of the Global Compact for Migration, and for the newly established United Nations Network uh, on migration, with postings in both the International Labour Organization headquarters in Geneva and at the International Labour Organization office for the United Nations in New York. So he has been not only a globetrotter but a social welfare activist, and very much concerned for the labor migration issues, as well as the humane aspect. He has always been instinctually carrying on. Thank you, Mr. Shabari. Please, we welcome you. Take the floor to deliver your discourse.
Thanks so much, Jayshree. Can you hear me?
Sure, sir, we can.
Very good. Great. What an absolute pleasure. Thank you for the invitation, to you and to BNU for having me here. And it's good to be on this panel. Sarthak, absolute pleasure listening to you. And I'm glad you reiterated on some of those very important, what should we call them? Fundamental points, right? And sometimes it's always good to look back into history to see where we are today and to see where we are now. So thanks for reiterating that. In fact, I did not know that it was India that actually called for the movement of people, the free movement of people within a particular state. So, maybe I should refresh after listening to you my own history of understanding of the UDHR. And of course, to Professor Azzariti as well, good to be on the panel with you. As I was beginning to prepare for this conversation, I thought, well, let's go by what Jayshree has suggested to mark this, what is this, the 73rd anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right? On this 73rd anniversary, I thought, well, what better than reiterating some of the points that Sarthak already has mentioned. So I won't repeat them because Sarthak has already spoken about it. But I wanted to bring your attention to the word equality. And focusing on the issue of inequalities, I therefore want to put a positive spin to it, and therefore talk about equalities. And the positive spin to the issue of equalities actually is from the UDHR. Article 1 of UDHR talks about how all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Fundamental article. Important for us to start there. Article number 7 states all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of law. All are entitled to equal protection against any discrimination. And that is an important perspective to bring in. And finally, the very important Article 23, which Sarthak spoke about, also as the article that Sarthak said, which India pushed for, particularly with regards to just and favorable conditions of work. And what a proud moment it is for me as an ILO representative to hear that it was India that actually put it there, because the 4 clauses of Article 23, which talks about the right to work, to free choice of employment, to just and favorable conditions of work, and to protection against unemployment, the very first clause is a direct reference to the importance of the decent work agenda for all workers, irrespective of where they work and what aspect of work or employment they are engaged in. And it also goes on to say, in fact, clause number 2 of that very same article calls for the right to equal pay for equal work without any discrimination. It also talks about the right to just and favorable remuneration, ensuring for himself and his family an existence worthy of human dignity. Sarthak, then here my question is, well, I'm happy to hear that man was changed to human beings, but somebody missed the him, and somebody missed the himself, and perhaps the need for that to have been himself or herself, to also talk about gender equality. And the last clause there, everyone has the right to form and to join trade unions for the protection of his interests. How very fascinating. Now, if I were to bring all these 3 articles and clauses into one singular article within the UDHR, that would be Article 13, which Sarthak spoke about, the right to movement. But the reason why I want to bring attention to that is, as much as it is important to talk about the right to movement within the state, that particular article does not make a reference to the right to work. Therefore, Article 13, or for that matter, any of the articles in the UDHR should not be seen in isolation. Every one of the 30 articles should be seen as interlinking characters that lead from one to another. These articles, unfortunately, in the UDHR and having been in multilateral positions, we will constantly hear member states talk about which article suits their interests. It is therefore important for us to reiterate that each one of these articles are not to be seen in isolation, but that they are interlinked with all the other articles. The second clause to the Article 13, which talks about the freedom of movement, talks about, Sarthak pointed out to this, let me repeat, because that is the crux of the migration issues, which is the right to leave any country, it states, including his own, and to return to his country. Right to leave and right to return. But that article does not, unfortunately, talk about the right to entry. Majority of the inequalities that we see in the current prevailing world in the context of migration is exactly in that missing element. It's perfectly fine for all of us to be able to leave our country and return to our own countries, but if we do not address the gaps with regards to the workplace environment in a destination country or in a destination state, automatically we are not addressing the inequalities that are most prevalent in those places. That I wanted to underline in the context of this discussion on UDHR inequalities and the area of my of what I wanted to bring to you, the issue of migration. Let me put some facts and figures out there. I wanted to bring you the aspect of international migration for India and the facet of internal migration for India. And we have to always keep this in mind, that we cannot have a discussion on migration without, one, highlighting where India stands in the migration scenario, and within that, both aspects of international and internal migration. First, on international migration. There are over 281 million migrants in the world. That is as per last year's migrant stock that was released, 281 million migrants. Out of those 281 million migrants, the ILO's global estimates says that there are 169 million migrant workers. So migrants includes refugees, workers, internationally displaced people, members of families, and within that, just the migrant workers population is 169 million. This is globally. Out of those 169 million, close to 50 million come from South Asia. So almost 1/3 of the world's global migrant worker population comes from South Asia. And out of those 50 million, close to 18 million or over 18 million migrant workers come from India. This makes India not only the largest migrant sending country within South Asia, but also in the world. That automatically raises the perspectives with regards to how India should be viewed and Indians should be viewed in the context of migration. That is on international migration. In the internal migration angle, and here we don't have figures for the entire world, they say that there are over 700 to 800 million internal migrants, including internally displaced people in the world. Well, guess what? As per the 2011 census, more than half that population are just in India. India has the largest population of internal migrants in the world, and this is not me saying, The 2011 census states that there are over 455 million internal migrants within India. This points to clause number 1 of Article 13, which talks about the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. If we use these two perspectives, let us then dissect the element of inequalities and where inequalities fits in both these perspectives in the context of both internal migration and international migration. Let me take the element of internal migration first. We need to understand what the drivers of migration in India are. So when we talk about internal migration, what are these drivers? What leads people to migrate in the first place? I'll give you two big elements. The first is socio-economic disenfranchisement. Now, among the workers who make majority of these migrant workers within India, the overrepresentation is from the side of Adivasis, Dalits, religious minorities, the poor, the less educated, the landless, those from rural areas, and those who are engaged in agriculture in their source regions where they come from. Now, the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector specifically established a nexus between poverty, vulnerability, and the type of employment along with the social status of workers. So therefore, any conversation that we have on inequalities in the context of India, specifically now referring to migration, we need to recognize what the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, NCEUS, spoke about. And it speaks about this nexus of poverty, vulnerability, type of employment, and social status of workers. Now, because of these reasons, these workers tend to take the riskiest, the lowest paying, and the most hazardous jobs with clear patterns of segmentation when it comes to caste and gender. Now, this specific aspect signifies how social inequalities are therefore replicated in the segmentation of labor markets. Disadvantaged caste groups, for example, embrace migration as an opportunity. If I come from a lower caste, I'm happy to migrate, right? Because it is an opportunity for me to escape unfair practices in the village that I am in, such as caste-based discrimination in terms of accessing employment, for instance. And it plays a crucial role in terms of making it a poverty interrupter. Migration helps me interrupt my poverty. It is a poverty mitigation strategy, right? Or a poverty alleviation strategy. This is important for us to recognize in terms of what drives migration within our country. A second element, and this one is perhaps much more obvious to most of us, and that is the issue of urbanization. Uneven growth and urbanization are among the biggest drivers of internal migration in India. Did you know that of the world's 20 fastest growing cities between 2019 and 2035, 17. So world's 20 fastest growing cities, 17 of them are in India. The central, eastern, and northeastern parts of India have very low levels of urbanization. So that's the central, northern, and northeastern. At the destination sites, this supply of workers is therefore met with short-term demand for low-wage workers. There is a problem with regards to how a lot of the people, it forces, given the fact that there is a low level of urbanization in the northern, central, and northeastern, it forces workers to migrate to the southern and western regions, right? Which is where we see the majority of development. I come from the state of Kerala. Kerala, the daily wages go up to 1,000 rupees. And 1,000 rupees daily wages is perhaps one of the biggest that you could expect in a country like India. And it is almost a luxurious amount for anybody in that kind of a situation, particularly for a migrant worker from the northern part of the country. Now, at the destination side, therefore, this means that this supply of workers is met with very short-term demands for low-wage workers who will be willing to work without long-term entitlements of security of tenure, wage protection, insurance, and pension. Social protection. And therefore, the fact that we are also in a situation where a majority of workers in India do not have social protection. I mean, how can we expect these workers to have social protection if 90% of workers in our country are in the informal sector? Informality leads to inequalities and vice versa. They are both very interlinked. The reason for such a strong informality is the inequalities, these inequalities that I talk about, the socio-economic disenfranchisement or urbanization, and that leads to such strong inequalities between people, particularly in the migration context. Over the last few points now, I've spoken about internal migration. I want to now turn our attention to international migration. In the last 2 years, you must have all heard about the Vande Bharat mission. The Vande Bharat mission gained a lot of, let's say, a lot of PR. It was, and why was it so prominent? And this was not just in India. It gained so much importance in world news coverage. Why was that? It was simply because this was the biggest repatriation exercise that the world saw. We've never seen something like this in history since the Second World War, the repatriation of Indians. So when COVID hit us, inequalities were exacerbated, right? The moment these inequalities were exacerbated, we saw it in the form of job losses. We saw these inequalities exacerbated in the form of social protection measures and absolute disarray. We saw labor markets being wrecked. Now, in that kind of a situation, every time you think about workforces, if there are 10 people in a room and if 5 of you are migrants and 5 are locals, the first people to be fired will be the migrant worker. So we always say that the first to be fired and the last to be hired are migrants. Now, in that context, when migrants are immediately fired, this is exactly what happened in both the internal and international migration situation. But this led to the Vande Bharat mission bringing back a lot of workers who lost their jobs in countries other than their own as migrant workers. Now, this is very, very important for us to take into consideration, given that the government of India, under the leadership of the Ministry of External Affairs, brought back over 8 million, that's over 80 lakh migrants from around the world, majority of them from the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, the GCC in the Middle East. The ILO last year used to release COVID monitoring reports. In those COVID monitoring reports, we forecasted a job loss of over 8 million workers, or 8 million jobs were lost in the Middle East alone. How many migrants are there in the Middle East? Over 23 million, close to 19 million male and 4 million female. Who are majority, who will be losing part of these 8 million losses of jobs? Migrants. So it is important for us to recognize that international migration is therefore rife with inequalities, as is internal migration. And that international migration aspect is what we saw in the form of these people returning to their countries, now looking for jobs in their own countries. Reintegration measures had to be put in place. Now imagine this. Let's talk about, you must have all seen in the newspapers, all these workers walking back because of the lockdown. They couldn't get transportation. They were therefore walking back from Rajasthan or Punjab to Bihar and Uttar Pradesh. That walk, the long march between the states in our country, also is not only is an example for inequalities, but also is an example of the lack of opportunities in their own states. In fact, Indian Express had a very famous article with a fantastic headline at one point last year, where the headline was, and let me say this in Hindi, and then I translate it for those who don't know Hindi. It said, the migrant worker who was interviewed said, "Sir, yahan pe Bhagwan milega, lekin kham nahi milega." That is a migrant worker who went back to his state, which translates to, I will find God here, but I will not find work. Now, it is important for us to recognize that it is work that contributes to strong perspectives, decent work that contributes to strong perspectives of equality or reducing inequalities. Unfortunately, that is exactly what was lost there. So if this is the case for internal migrant workers, now imagine those who have not lived in their country and are coming back. Where is the reintegration perspective for them? You need policies in place, you need legal frameworks in place, you need a whole range of institutional arrangements in place before you can expect these people to be reintegrated into the job market at the social level much more effectively. And that is important for us to take into consideration as we talk about inequalities. A final couple of points from my side. Every time we talk about inequalities, we need to perhaps go back to that one global development agenda that India, along with 192 other countries, unitedly and unanimously adopted in 2015. This is the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development Goals. I remember being a part of the negotiations of the 2030 Agenda at the time, and we could see how countries, how governments of the 193 countries were so excited about the fact that we moved from the MDGs to the SDGs in a manner where the SDGs was based on the MDGs, but we had moved from 8 goals to 17 goals. We had moved from, 18 targets to 169 targets. And we had moved from 48 indicators in the MDGs to over 250 global indicators in the SDGs. What a tremendous moment this was in the history of development perspectives. What we did not see in the MDGs, however, was the perspective of inequalities being actually unpacked and unraveled. But in the SDGs, they did that, because Goal 10 specifically talks about reducing inequalities within and amongst countries. And so within that, they had a whole range of targets. 10.7 is my favorite target, because that particular target under Goal 10 on inequalities talks about facilitating safe, orderly, regular, and responsible migration between and amongst countries as being a singular element responsible for reducing inequalities. We have to therefore take that into consideration along with indicator 10C, that talks about reducing remittance costs. Now, it's easier for us to transfer money within India, we think, if we have a bank account, but think of those migrant workers who don't have access to bank accounts, even within their own countries, particularly even within India. Now, think about the difficulty then in the context of international migration. The SDGs, therefore, are the singular way to establish how important it is for us to recognize that if we talk about inequalities, then let's do that by first talking about leaving no one behind. Because if we leave no one behind, we will be attaining full responsibility for the achievement of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Jayshree, I'll stop with that. Back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Shabari. Your subjectivity is very much intense, not only in delivering the data world across about Indians as migrants, as laborers, etc., etc. Why I'm so interested in this kind of webinar, because our literature field is totally full of subjectivities and emotional upheavals, acculturation, adaptation, assimilation, appropriateness. It's totally very engrossing to do research in these perspectives when the precarity and the subjectivity is the context of the literary novels. And our researchers would definitely, if they would go through your deliberation, they would get some points of theorizing the novelist mind, how the novelist mind theorizes the labor, and then they try to emotionally float that context in the events and conversation and the dialogues of the novel. But point is that where you have very much well illustrated, another thing is that how the disproportionate context is very much into practice, not only in crossing borders, attaining jobs, with regard to occupational safety, health, and prosperity. These are the issues that you are really doing and taking up in your decent work team, hopefully. And even you have given us your target. But point is that when I was just going through some European Union studies with regard to human rights and the civil practices that taken up to uh, mitigate such problems. So I felt that there is one movie on Netflix, Colonia. It's talking about dignity that was nullified with regard to the Chill citizens, because the colony of Spanish or colony of even other European areas in Chile had really subjugated and you may say violated the citizens' life, and so much of atrocity was intolerable. And then another on, I think our Professor Salvatore would be highlighting what context we can take with regard to the protection of these indignified areas that are taking up so immensely in the world. But before Professor Salvatore, I think I would like to first welcome Professor Dinesh Singh. I request Shabari Nair and Sarthak Roy to stay in, at least because you are the young speakers, and you have to go through your experienced, learned speakers also's discourse, so that you can give further, some kind of effectiveness to this discourse. So Professor Dinesh Singh is our on board, and he has joined in. He had been Vice Chancellor of University of Delhi in the period of 2010 to 15. Then he was also the director of South Campus, because University of Delhi is divided into North Campus and South Campus. And then he also took the position of Chancellor in KR Mangalam University, currently located in Gurgaon, Haryana area of India. And he had also been to London as academic consultant in Middlesex University. He also accredited for being the Distinguished Senior Fellow, Advanced Hack Space in the Imperial College of Science, Technology and Medicine of London in the period of 2015 and 18. Basically, his forte is not into any humanities or social science. He is a man of mathematics, so very much odd man out in the field of human rights. So it would be very welcoming for us to listen to him, how he thinks about this context of Universal Declaration of Human Rights with regard to human development. Another important contribution of his is that he is also been Adjunct Professor of Mathematics in the University of Houston, Texas, USA. And with regard to his acclamation worldwide, we can see through the level of, his achievements, that he got honorary doctorate from various universities, especially University of Edinburgh, National University of Ireland, University of Houston, and National Institute of Technology and Science in Kurukshetra, that is Kurukshetra University of Haryana in India. He was also awarded one of the highest civilian award of the Government of India, that is Padma Shri. So we welcome with our in-depth gratitude for the gracious presence, and your precious words would definitely enrich us. Thank you, Professor Dinesh Singh for coming in and joining us. We now leave the floor for you for your words. We can't hear you, sir. Your mic is mute. Your microphone is mute.
Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. It's a delight to be present here today. And thank you for your kind introduction. Also, thank you for mentioning that I'm the odd man out. So don't expect anything great or worthwhile from me, but I'll do my best to make your time reasonable. I chose the title to be the Gandhian approach to human rights. And I deliberately chose that title. And actually, I would like, with your permission, to modify that a little bit. And I would say the Gandhian approach to humane rights, to humanism. If we were to understand that, I think all other aspects of human rights, whether it's the Universal Declaration or whatever you wish, will fall in place. Things will begin to make sense if we adopt this universal humanism that Gandhi believed in. And it wasn't just Gandhi, but I've chosen Gandhi for many reasons. I've chosen Gandhi because I understand him a little better than I understand many other folks. Not that I understand Gandhi perfectly, don't misunderstand me. As Dr. Jayshree mentioned, I'm really a mathematician. But I admire Gandhi and I try to learn much from him. I also feel that what Gandhi had to espouse was something universal by itself. It wasn't just Gandhi who said it. It wasn't just Gandhi who practiced it. In many lands, in many cultures, and in many ages, the same ideas have been put forth by many other great individuals. And Gandhi was the first to admit that I have said nothing new. Truth and nonviolence are as old as the Himalayas. So take it from that point of view. And if I have to speak on Gandhi, we must try and understand Gandhi a little bit. So allow me to sort of dwell very briefly on that. So Mahatma Gandhi was really shaped by his quest for truth. Everything else was secondary in his life. Whatsoever action he undertook, whatsoever thoughts he undertook, all of them were designed to help him understand the absolute truth in a better way. And as time went by, Gandhi's understanding of that truth began to improve. So the Gandhi that you come to know from his early years is a little different from the Gandhi who had evolved into a higher being. And you must keep that perspective also in mind. But the one thing that does not change about Gandhi is his fervent desire to come to grips with the absolute truth. That quest for truth is something that drives Gandhi, and he equated truth with God. So for Gandhi, that was his God, and he had to come to merge himself with this God as his quest in life. And once you do that, then you begin to understand Gandhi's philosophy. Remember, Gandhi was deeply influenced by Jain philosophy. In his childhood, because of his mother, who used to engage with many Jain thinkers, the impact on Gandhi is just as important. And Gandhi understood this universal aspect of human rights from that point of view. Gandhiji repeatedly emphasizes the fact that even the Buddha equates all life forms. It isn't just humans. The Buddha had compassion for all life forms. Bhagwan Mahavir had compassion for all life forms. It's this compassion that allows you to see the same thing in all living beings. And I must mention something else. Gandhi was also profoundly impacted by the Bhagavad Gita. In fact, he calls the Gita his mother. In his own words, he equates the Gita to his mother. Gita Mata, that is the status he gives to the Bhagavad Gita. And what is it that appeals to Gandhi in the Gita? So I'm not trying to espouse any religion. Please do not misunderstand me. I find much greatness in all religions, in all philosophies. I have nothing against anything. The reason why I talk about the Gita or the Buddha or Mahavir or even Jesus Christ is because they played an important role in Gandhiji's life. Even Islam plays a very important role in Gandhiji's life. But at this point in time, I want to come back to the Gita, where he accords the Gita the status of mother. And what is it that appeals to Gandhi in the Gita? There are many things, but here's one. In the Gita, when Sri Krishna talks to Arjuna about this universal aspect of life, all equal, he says categorically, this verse, I'm quoting almost verbatim as a translation from Chakravarti Rajgopalachari, that a true sage, Sri Krishna tells Arjuna that a true sage makes no distinction between a Brahman rich with learning, a cow, an elephant, a dog, or an eater of dogs. Do you see this? There is no distinction. They are all equal in God's eyes. They are all equal as living beings. A Brahman rich with learning, a cow, an elephant, a dog, or an eater of dogs. All are equal. That is what should drive our understanding of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. If you are willing to equate all living beings, all life forms, then naturally all humans have certainly first and foremost to be considered to be equal. And that was Gandhi's essential philosophy. That drove him. That is something that he believed in firmly and practiced with greater and greater effect as time went by. And he brings that into his own personal life. So he had given a vow to his mother that he is not going to indulge in non-vegetarian food and alcohol when he was in England to study, to practice as a barrister, qualified as a barrister. And he adheres to that. During his quest to find alternative forms of vegetarian food, because that was not easy in those days in England, he comes into contact with other folks who have kind of philosophy that Gandhi takes to very naturally. They were kindred spirits for Gandhi. So he comes across two young Englishmen who made Gandhi's acquaintance with the hope that Gandhi will be able to acquaint them with the Bhagavad Gita. And Gandhi says in his autobiography that I was embarrassed that I hadn't really read the Gita. But then this is the first true exposure to the Gita that Gandhi has. And Gandhi being Gandhi, he gets into it lock, stock and barrel. So he engages with it with complete sincerity, complete surrender. And he begins to understand and imbibe the Gita. And what happens after that? So you see, there is this, you see that he finds Englishmen there who also find the Gita appealing. And again, I again emphasize, this doesn't mean that therefore other religions do not appeal to people. There is nothing like this. I'm just talking of Gandhi's story here. And so there is something universal here that appeals to these Englishmen and also to Gandhi, the Bhagavad Gita. And behind the Bhagavad Gita is this Upanishadic talk, the Upanishadic philosophy. That is universal. And I'll tell you a little bit about it and how it transcends time and it transcends the tyranny of geography. Why do I say that? You will have to be a little patient with me, but let me explain. So Gandhi is then profoundly impacted not just by the Gita, but as time goes by, Upanishadic thought, Upanishadic philosophy also impacts him. And here is something very interesting in the Chandogya Upanishad, one of Gandhi's favorite Upanishads. There is this, and the Upanishads are historical recordings of the great gurus and their lives and their teachings. So in the Chandogya Upanishad is this episode of a young boy of 12 who sets forth to the Gurukul of the great guru Gautam Haridrumat. And when he reaches Haridrumat's Gurukul and engages with Haridrumat, Haridrumat says, like they do even today in modern times, when you seek to gain admission to any institution of learning, you have to give some details of your background. So Haridrumat asks, child, of what lineage are you? Because we admit only Brahmins. And the child says that I asked this question of my mother when I set forth for your Gurukul. And here is what my mother said, and I recount it to you. My mother said that I have worked as a maid in many homes, and many men have taken advantage of me. I have no idea who your father is, but you proclaim yourself with pride that you are Satyakam, son of the maid Jabala. And when Satyakam recounts this to Haridrumat, here is how Haridrumat reacts. Haridrumat says, child, I admit you, for you are a true Brahman. A Brahman is not by birth. A Brahman is only by adherence to the truth. Do you see that? This equates everyone. All you need to do is adhere to the truth. It has nothing to do with your caste. It has nothing to do with your religion. It has nothing to do with anything. It doesn't mention religion. It doesn't mention your caste. It doesn't mention your land. It doesn't mention your family. All it says is you adhere to the truth and you are a Brahman, because literally speaking, a Brahman is one who gets to know Brahma Gyan, this supreme knowledge. That's a Brahman. That's all there is to it. Brahma Gyan is supreme knowledge, again not linked to any religion. That is universal. And how universal could it be? So this Upanishadic thoughts, and particularly the Bhagavad Gita, they impact Gandhi. But Gandhi is also influenced. He is also influenced by some great Western thinkers. He is also influenced by Jesus Christ. And he is also influenced by great Western thinkers, particularly members of the Transcendentalist movement, the Concord movement, Emerson, Thoreau, Ruskin, Carlyle, so many of them. And when you delve into Carlyle and Ruskin and Thoreau and all of them, what is it that is common to them? They were all heavily influenced by Upanishadic thought and the Bhagavad Gita. Emerson and Thoreau used to keep the Bhagavad Gita on their bedside, and they used to read it every day. No wonder Gandhi was influenced by their thoughts. And the story doesn't end here. So now let's look at this story. The universality of the thoughts here, which are so linked with human rights, that all humans are created equal. They are all equal. And anyone who knows the supreme knowledge is a Brahman. Nothing else, nothing more, not by birth, not by anything else. Such universalism. Now just look. This starts from much before the time of the Christ, when the Upanishads were first created. Then they travel centuries later and across the 7 oceans to the United States. Then they come back and influence Gandhi again in the very land of the origins of these thoughts. Then look what happens. Just before India gets independence, Gandhi is visited by a delegation of American blacks who come to seek Gandhi's support, advice, and solace over the lack of human rights that the blacks have received in the United States. And here is something prophetic that Gandhi tells them. He says, it may well be that the message of non-violence and truth will reach the Western world through the American blacks. In that group of American blacks that has come to seek Gandhi's advice, help, and support is a man who teaches in an institution where his own class consists of many people, including a young black by the name of Martin Luther King. When this teacher reaches back to the United States and talks about his experience with Gandhi, King listens to it and is impacted profoundly. So King again talks about human rights in his civil rights movement. When he talks of, I have a dream, that's all he's talking about, this business of having universal human rights. And where is it coming from? Profoundly impacted by Mahatma Gandhi, who is profoundly impacted by Emerson and Thoreau, who are in King's land. But King is impacted by Gandhi. Gandhi by Emerson, Thoreau. Emerson, Thoreau by the Upanishads. See how back and forth these ideas go? Because they are universal. They talk of universality of human rights. And the story doesn't end there. King and Gandhi influenced Nelson Mandela in turn. And this will happen throughout the ages in the days to come. It isn't just about the days of yore. This will happen in the days to come as well. That is what I mean, this humane approach to human rights, or Gandhi's approach to humane rights. And there is a universality in that. And Gandhi applied that in his personal life in so many ways. Do not get this impression that he was perfect in every sense. He himself says that he knows every day all his deficiencies. He was a profound believer in what Kabir said. Nindak niyare rakhiye, keep a critic at hand, because the critic will always keep you grounded to the earth. That is so important. And that is something, when we talk about this universal declaration of human rights, that is something we must always keep close to our own hearts, keep close to our own thoughts, because we tend to forget. Look how Gandhi practices them. When he is in South Africa and he asks Ba to help him clean the toilets of all his house guests. In those days, toilets were built differently and they required a different kind of scavenging. Ba refuses. And here is Gandhi who cannot tolerate it. Now, isn't he denying Ba her own rights to assert that she will not do that job? He gets upset and he tries to ask Ba to leave. In fact, forces her to leave the house, and when they're at the gate of their entrance, that's where Ba then tells him that, have you no shame? I have no one here. Where will I go? Then they realize the errors of, he particularly realizes the error of his ways, and he weeps unabashedly. And as time goes by, look what happens. Then when in South Africa later, when Ba falls ill seriously and has lost a great deal of blood, and the surgeon advises Gandhi, she's in a hospital, she's undergone surgery, advises Gandhi that she must have non-vegetarian food, otherwise she will not survive. Gandhi, who is under a vow not to eat non-vegetarian food, says, I have no objection to Ba eating, but I will not force her to change her views. I am willing to come with you and speak to Ba and ask her, will she consider this? And here is Ba's response. When they go, the surgeon and Gandhi, and ask Ba if she will partake of some non-vegetarian food, and she refuses, the surgeon turns to Gandhi and says, you cannot ask a patient. This is medicine. She has to take it. And Gandhi says, I will not enforce this on her. Ba says, I'm willing to die, but I'm not willing to touch non-vegetarian food. He respects Ba's right to deny, even though it will be a great loss to Gandhi if Ba does not survive. That is called true practice of the right to respect Ba's wishes. Don't get this impression that Gandhi was not so attached to Ba. When Ba finally does die at the Aga Khan Palace, Gandhi nearly dies a few days after that when he falls ill seriously. It isn't that. He was so attached to Ba. Yet Gandhi respects her right not to partake of non-vegetarian food. And this story goes on in so many ways. When finally Gandhi returns to India, And he goes off to Champaran to explore and understand the woes of the indigo workers in those plantations in Bihar. In his quest to understand the peasants who work over there, he realizes, he comes across all of them in utter poverty, but he realizes, he comes across this lady who is wearing an extremely dirty sari, very soiled. And Gandhi chides her, says, why don't you wash your sari? And here is a stark truth. This is Gandhi's quest for the truth. Here is a stark truth that hits Gandhi when the lady responds, I would love to wash, but this is the only piece of garment that I have. If I wash, what will I wear? And here is Gandhi's understanding and practice of the need to make people understand human rights by his humane approach. That very day, Gandhi takes a vow not to wear clothes that have been stitched and to wear the humblest of all garments. So all he really does is wear a loincloth, and he occasionally will take a khadi shawl and wrap his shoulders. Otherwise, he does not wear any other kind of clothing. That is called this. You will never understand this universality of human rights until you understand the universality of the soul of every being. That is precisely what Gandhi was trying to do. And as time went by, he evolved more and more on this count. And you know, I sometimes lament the fact that in these times of social media and this and that, we get influenced by thoughts that are superficial or extraneous to the matter at hand. We get swayed by emotions. We must keep in mind all these great ennobling thoughts. They ennoble and they enable. And sometimes I worry. I came across this episode all of you are aware of, when the cricket captain of the Indian team was abused by someone on social media, and his 1-year-old infant daughter was threatened with rape and such things. This is abhorrent. I mean, we cannot condemn it enough. I really abhor it. I detest it. It must be stopped. It must not happen. But here is something that bothers me. You know, this man, whoever he was, and I'm not condoning it in any sense of the term. All I'm trying to tell you is we must respect certain rights that all individuals have. Innocent until proved guilty. Remember this. Innocent until proved guilty. And here is all of media, news channels, everyone. Once they apprehend this gentleman, he is declared guilty. He hasn't been tried yet. I am not condoning him. Please do not misunderstand me. It's a reprehensible act. But wait till we find him guilty. There is a small chance that someone may have hacked his account. Who knows? Until we find out all aspects of the matter, let us not be so quick to condemn the man, condemn the act, condemn the fact that these things happen. You must try and stop those, but do not hold the man guilty yet. That is what worries me. It violates basic human rights. And let me cite a judgment in the United States Supreme Court just a few years ago, during the time that Robert Bork has been presiding. Just a few years ago, there was this gentleman, I think his name was Elon Sis. I cannot remember his name, but he threatened his ex-wife with murder on Facebook. And then right at the bottom, he writes, these are just thoughts. Something to that effect. But it's a clear threat that I will murder you. The man is apprehended because the wife files a complaint. And then the lower courts hold him guilty. Even the court, the court just before the Supreme Court, I think it's called the Court of Circuit Appeals or something like that. Even that pronounces him guilty. The matter goes to the Supreme Court. And in the Supreme Court, by a judgment of 7-1, one dissenting judgment, the man is held innocent. We need to think about this. You know, this ability to give space to people. This judgment is worth reading. When all the lower courts hold him guilty, the United States Supreme Court holds this fundamental right as a right of absolutely inviolable to express yourself to a point. And this man is allowed to express himself up to a point and thus acquitted. That judgment must be brought into mainstream discussion. I don't find that happening. It violates human rights. You're holding a man guilty without even examining him, without giving him a chance to defend himself. Even Godse, who was witnessed by hundreds when he murdered Gandhi, is given a chance to defend himself before they formally pronounce him guilty. I think we must respect people's rights in those senses. That would have made Gandhi much happier. Gandhi respects so much other people's rights on these matters, human rights, that at Vartha, and here is a man who is an avowed vegetarian who's letting his wife, is willing to let his wife die rather than force her to eat meat. But at his ashram in Wardha, when Badshah Khan visits him, Gandhi decides to cook meat for Badshah Khan personally. People chide Gandhi for that. That you are a vegetarian, you have been served, and you cook non-vegetarian food for a guest. And Gandhi says, I respect Badshah Khan's right to decide what he wants to eat. I will never eat meat. But he wishes to eat meat. He cannot survive without meat. And I will not take away his right to eat meat from him. Where will he get meat from? Any place here, he is my guest. It is my bounden duty to make sure that he gets his meat, and Gandhi cooks the meat for him. That is something that we must understand about Gandhi when we talk of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This ability to respect another point of view, to give it space to the extent possible. You cannot say, therefore, accommodate everything in every contrarian view. But within this space of reasoned debate, within this space of rationalism, there must be enough weightage accorded to such points of view if you ever talk of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You can have all kinds of formal declarations, you can have all kinds of viewpoints, you can create all kinds of laws, you can pass all kinds of resolutions, all platforms, at all fora. Nothing will happen until you change the human heart, the human spirit, and get them to understand what the Bhagavad Gita says. All are equal. All living beings are equal. Unless you do this, nothing else will matter. That is all I had to say to you today. Thank you very much.
So, Professor Sam, we are really amazed by your in-depth understanding of Mahatma Gandhi. But our question to you is, have you ever come across Mahatma Gandhi in person?
No,
when you were very
I
young?
was born much after he died.
Okay. But anyway, you have well elaborated, expounded, explored his phenomena of life and how he had dealt both the things in his two seminal books, Hind Swaraj and My Experiments with Truth. And it's really amazing. We should give you standing ovation as we all are young to you, and really you have given us like a kind of a doctrine to lead our basics for human growth and development and for our self-emancipation in that context. Otherwise, we will be just going around in a one-dimensional position for our ends and for our means. Thank you, sir, for giving us such kind of exhaustive, illustrative speech.
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Anybody wants to say something to Professor Shabari, Sarthak? Yeah, Shabari, can you give us some of your observations?
Thanks, Jayshree. I will take this opportunity. I know that Salvatore has to speak, but I cannot. Professor Singh, what an absolute honor listening to you. I've had the opportunity of listening to you once before at a transnational educational conference in 2014 in Kerala, when you were invited at the time by the former Indian ambassador T.P. Srinivasan for a discussion in Kerala, and you were one of the keynote speakers there. You bring back so many memories on so many discussions that only you could do in with such justice, sir. So absolute pleasure. I want to take this opportunity because I don't think otherwise, it would be disservice to my presence here with you. Let me ask you, sir, dignity of labor. You said that we need to keep the UDHR close to our heart. We are also a country where we have not yet recognized the importance of giving dignity to everyone's labor. We unfortunately, we segregate people based on the kind of professions that they are in, the work that they do. Any thoughts on that? Any reflections on that from your own side, sir? Thank you, sir.
I'm so glad you asked that. First of all, thank you very much for your kind words. I remember my visit to Kerala on that occasion. As I do on every visit to Kerala, it has been a great place for me. Incidentally, I'm digressing, but Kerala has been the mecca of mathematics, which very few people seem to be aware of. But hundreds of years before the time of Isaac Newton, Kerala had discovered and taken calculus forward to amazing heights. So Kerala has special space in my own heart. And I'm a great, my wife, in fact, it teases me that you must have been a Keralite in your last life, So thank you so much for your kind words and for reminding me of that visit. However, this business of dignity of labor, what little I've understood, and of the great people that I've admired, whether they be from the time of the Upanishads, where even in this episode of Satyakam, once he is admitted by Gautam Haridrumat, he is not asked to go recite or memorize the Vedas. Haridrumat sends him off to the forest with a few hundred head of cattle and says, do not return until they have multiplied so many fold. This is an exercise in wealth management, but it is an exercise in very practical terms. And there is enormous labor involved. Here is a man who says we admit only Brahmins, and here he is telling him to indulge in manual labor. You have to take care of it. Nobody goes with Satyakam. He has to do this on his own. And all through, this is what I find is universal to all the great people that I've admired. Remember, Jesus Christ was apprenticed to his father as a carpenter. Paigambbar Sahab was a herdsman. Don't forget that. Guru Nanak insisted that all his disciples should work in the fields. Kabir was a weaver. Mahatma Gandhi used to forever spin the charkha. Feynman was extraordinarily gifted with the use of his hands and used to repair radios. The Dalai Lama loves repairing watches. Isaac Newton was a gifted craftsperson. Albert Einstein was another gifted craftsperson who held more than 50 inventions and patents to his credit in addition to special relativity and general relativity. He invented the world's first safe modern refrigerator and the world's first automatic camera. They were all very good with their hands. It is business of labor. You see, as W.B. Yeats put it, you require a proper equipoise between the moral, the sensory, and the experiential. That is the intellectual. It is so important. And somehow in our country, we need to emphasize this more and more. Mahatma Gandhi, of course, his whole life exemplifies that. Yet we do not imbibe it. I was just talking today at lunchtime with some colleagues, and we were discussing about how people shirk from washing their own dishes, no matter where they are. They will insist on someone else to wash their dishes after they've had their meals because they consider it below their dignity. This has to somehow go. The Indian philosophies that we have had here and also in other parts of the world do not espouse this. I agree with you totally. We need to work on this.
Thank you, sir, for being here. Sarthak, could you wait? Because we will request Professor Dinesh Singh ji to please stay for more half an hour so that our Professor Salvatore Tolone Azzariti from University of Oxford He's a professor of civil law. He's going to deliver his speech, and we would like that you have to be there for his motivation to that you are chairing and listening to him
Sure,
and
sure.
giving your
I
observations.
will look forward to that.
Yes, sir. So we welcome Professor Salvatore Tolone. Please take the floor and start with your speech.
Thanks so much. And Honorable Professor Dinesh Singh, Honorable Dr Satyak Roy, Honorable Dr Shabarinath Nair, honorable speakers and co-reporters, all kind participants and listeners. Once again, I thank the Honorable Bhopal, Nobles University and its management staff for this invitation, which, as you can understand, highly honors me and enables me to take part in such a prestigious panel of speakers today. My special greetings and thanks go to Professor Jayshree Singh for her tireless and fruitful work of organization and sensitivity towards legal studies that adorns the entire Bhopal Nobles University. The framework of my talk, as reflected in the title and the concept derived from Germanic law, Indirect Third Party Efficacy, or so-called Mittelbare Drittwiekung, directly introduces what is my analytical perspective, a perspective consistent with my narrow and humble academic expertise, namely that of private law. I'm afraid that this will entail the loss of the magic commensurate with the topic we are dealing with. But I hope to compensate this loss by highlighting how a legal interpreter works when he has to bring human rights in concrete everyday life. By scanning the relevant terms of the title of my intervention, the reference to the context also emerges. I believe there should be not be much difficulty in perceiving its meaning, even having reference to what has been told until now by the other honorable speakers that prevent me. One of the primary ambitions of the Declaration of Human Rights, as we have recently recalled here also, was not to provide an extemporaneous or territorially limited response to the issues that were on the table, but to respond to them according to a certain and precise philosophical and political characteristic, the universalizability of the legal response. In elementary terms, it entails two fundamental characteristics that in law are usually summarized as generality and abstractness. That is, the legal postulates of the Declaration have in themselves not only the vocation of territorial universality, but also that of diachronic universality, of their extension over time. The Declaration does not only look at the country, a continent, an homogeneous geographical area from an ethnic, political, or institutional point of view. It looks instead, as we say in Latin, in universum, at the whole world. It also does not incorporate a temporary paradigm, a specific moment or historical phase which it intends to remedy with the legal solution it provides. Even the tragic one of the Second World War, but it proposes itself as an eternal declaration of rights belonging to every human being, sub specie eternitatis. Thus, the context to which my title alludes is therefore a criterion that belongs to the implementation of the provisions in a determinate and concrete time and place, as an element that is linked to the exercise of rights by the subject who is the abstract recipient of them. Incorporating the context into the framework of legal evaluation, therefore, means absorbing into our activity, that is the activity of the interpreters of law, the jurisprudentes, an element that is complementary and essential at the same time. Context is complementary because part of the millenary tradition of mankind at all latitudes is the abstract and the general nature of laws. They are therefore necessarily aimed at application according to the context, needing to be implemented in concrete cases according to different degrees of concretization, by time, by place, by situation, by circumstances. The context is essential at the same time because within the passage from the abstract norm to the concrete case of application, aporias or anti-juridical situation may arise, contrary to the law, which the good interpreter must prevent or resolve according to the guidance of the science of law. With this reference, therefore, which I have illustrated here in an elementary and synthetic form, I wanted to introduce the field of application of human rights that is my responsibility and in respect to which my intervention will take place, namely private law. This delimitation of the field, private law, is necessary for me to adapt the theme of our Congress to this context, namely equality as a principle and as a value. We've already recalled in our previous conference by Bhopal Noble University the structural nature of Declaration of Human Rights, and we have illustrated why we consider it a pluralist, not multiculturalist, normative structure. This is because it is addressed to the protection of the individual as such, as an individual, not to the protection of the group or collective entities unless they are the expression of the rights of the individual. The entitlement established in the Declaration is not related to the individual as a member of a group, but to the individual as such. When violation of rights occur in the name of groups or cultures, the human rights of a man as an individual continue to be recognized and protected as such. The differentiation between pluralism and multiculturalism has to be put in a particular focus in order to avoid the perception of a conceptual antagonism. This may derive from the use of a notion of a variable content. Chaim Perelman, a Belgian philosopher of law, in French language, called them notions à contenu variable. That is between what is employed as equality in the application, in the process of jurisprudential formation of the law, and the multiple forms of equality that, requested by sociological, statistical, political, and other instances, permeate the area of law, shaping, according to specific connotations, the general principles of the legal system. The most attentive and careful doctrine has identified some profiles of the relationship between the typologies of concept of this second type, configuring, for example, a formal relationship of continence rather than antagonism. Therefore, we are not discussing two conceptual notions of the same term, equality, which are opposite or antagonistic, but of other profiles, their respective position in the legal system and the different applicative function. Thus, the concept that we can call here equality as a non-discrimination represents the basic ideal of equal treatment before the law, free from any caprice, arbitrary, or prejudicial treatment. The very least we demand as equal treatment before the law. This is a systematic value of private law, and we can call it equality in application. Every rule of private law is applied to different people who are subject to the same provision according to the principle of equality. That is, treating in equal manner that what is equal. Once it has been recognized from the pre-legal bodies, it assumes as an a priori element the existence of structural inequalities that deserve special treatment, making the principle of equality, understood in this way, perform the social function, for example, of reversing social practices of exclusion and the perpetuation of situation of inferiority. Despite this relationship of continents, the difference, both for these and for other interpretative hypotheses of equality, as we will also see later in the German experience of the efficacy of fundamental rights toward the third parties, and particularly in the Federal Constitutional Court of 1993, lies in the particular configuration among the many possible ones that the a priori recognition of structural inequality assumes, and in a normative form by which such recognition takes place. However, in the light of the elementary relationship between abstraction and concreteness, it does not seem difficult to differentiate and identify equality of application, here we delineate it, as a technique of the system of jurisprudential formation of law, as an element of the hermeneutic process, of the interpretation process, that in consequence to interpretation and comprehension of the norms characterizes the application of the norms present in the system. This different interpretation of equality, developed around the principles of the system when they are recognized, connote the genesis, the structure, and the function of the abstract rules that apply them. Equality as non-discrimination, equality as non-submission, or other ideas of equality connote the abstract norm that recognizes them. In contrast, equality in application, the equal treatment of what is equal, the private law equality, does not relate to a particular determined content of the norms. It applies as a system technique. A systematic technique that coordinates on a concrete level throughout a dialectical process the relationship between the result of the legal interpretation process, whatever the content of the normative structure that activates the interpretation, and the rest of the existing system. For example, the application of the criterion of similarity between concrete cases, always in the normal and well-known relationship between abstract and concrete, in order to avoid contradictions of assessment, the rule that favors one group of subjects is applied equally to all those who, on the basis of the criterion of similarity, fall into the class recognized and protected abstractly by the rule itself. The protection of a subject or a certain group of subjects by order of cases and circumstances is also to be applied and may be invoked by other subjects in similar cases. We protect expressions of thought as manifestation of religious freedom, and at the same time we recognize, under conditions of similarity, treating as equal what is equal, that similar manifestations can be protected as manifestations of a freedom of speech. The principle of equality in private law may imply a certain protection to certain types of employment, but it is quite clear that the private law system will accord the same protection to other types when the same circumstances apply. This type of equality, the private law and the equal treatment of what is equal, belongs to the fulfillment of the hermeneutic process between concrete cases, existing system, and norms. On the contrary, the other phenomenologies of equality, equality as non-discrimination, as they are interposed between the principle and the concrete connotation that is meant to be attributed to it with its legislative recognition, because in turn the principle of equality can mean many different postulates, belong to the genetic and structuring process of the norms. The former is developed having as object the institution of the system in their application, while the latter is developed about subjects as individuals or groups according to the classification criteria that recognize them. Looking at subjective situations, equality of application by encompassing the entire system at the operational level is naturally a reflection of the objective pluralism we mentioned above, because it operates at a more concrete level of classification and with concrete cases. Equality of application operates, for example, in conflicts between endogroupal subjective situations belonging to different members of the same protected group and conflicting each other. Also, it operates in conflicts between subjective situations qualified by the recognition of different groups, often assessing their extent with respect to other conflicting situations. Example, when equality promoting protection for a certain groups of people differently classified generates conflicts. It may happen when an hypothetical affirmative action protects a group ethnically based and not a group obtained by gender classification. It also operates in conflicts between subjective situations within the same group, but qualified as relevant by it at different points in time. Still, at the level of interpretation in private law, further differentiations among many can be evidenced with the focus on the exercise of the subjective situation. Normative recognitions of structural inequalities essentially contain a normative function, characterized by the overriding relevance of the interest that the legislator wants to promote with regard to a teleological orientation that is a normative purpose. For example, it is very well known that in the United States, affirmative action to promote women or African American students with respect to university education or employment through a quota system. This type of structuring imposes on the interpreter a link of teleological objective nature, in accordance with the function of this normative sector, and thus with the concrete definition of the subject's situation in this area, with the exclusive reference to the normative function and the evaluation and assessment recognized by the legislator. Again, in the same example, the class of subjects must be defined with a status, women or African American students. Accordingly, must be the purpose, university education or employment, and the recognized means that are the quota systems. This analytical framework is good to be examined under the experience of the horizontal efficacy of fundamental rights in Germany by third parties. The analytical framework of the application of constitutional principles as, recognizing human rights principle in private law is marked by the concept of constitutionalization of private law, which offers a parallel between the American system, we say, and other civil law systems. The concept of constitutionalization of private law encompasses the development of a general interpretative analysis of legislation and case law within the framework of civil law system. Its basic theoretical element is the principle of horizontal efficacy of constitutional norms and principles by third parties. That is not only the efficacy from the state to the subject, but also between the subjects, which in German law has been defined as Drittwiekung der Grundrechte, so the efficacy of fundamental rights by third parties. It has recognized the greater formative. When we compare American experience and German experience, it has been recognized that the greater formative, superseding aptitude of the constitution of a private law in the American experience, summed up in an sarcastic way in the statement saying that United States Constitution supersedes private law. In contrast, in German cases involving disputes between individuals, the German Constitution, so-called Grundgesetz or Basic Law, only influences the rules of private law. However, the doctrine agrees that the degree of formative aptitude depends on the presence or absence of a constituent element, the existence in the legal area of a state action that admits the specific interference in private law by the system of rules proper to constitutional law in the United States. There is a clear demarcation thus for the principles of fundamental rights to be effective. Only if there is a state action in a given matter, then the process that can lead to the superseding of private law by private constitutional law can take place. When there is the state action, the private constitutional law, the private law elaborated on the constitutional level by Supreme Court and the receiving the human rights can supersede the common normal private law. In this sense, it should be remembered that also some civil law systems recognize institutions that allow direct appeal to the Constitutional Court on the basis of fundamental rights. For example, indeed, in Germany itself, by Article 93 of the Constitution, it is established that the Federal Constitutional Court has jurisdiction over questions of unconstitutionality which can be brought by any subject who claims that a public authority has violated one of his fundamental rights. Undoubtedly, among the mentioned public authorities are included the courts in the exercise of jurisdiction. More specifically, with regard to a comparison between the two systems centered on the existence or not of a state action, the asymmetries in the preeminence of fundamental rights with regard to concretization have already been highlighted, identifying what is reflexively a different effective model of constitutionalization and also a differentiation in its nature. Given the normal vertical application of the Constitution, the American system, when there is a state action in a given case, extends horizontally between private parties. If there is a state action for the violation of a constitutional principle, the principle can also be enforced by private action between private parties. The doctrine developed at this level is thus expressed in its entirety, and thus the superseding of private law, of normal private law, can be argued. This highlights the separation between the two systems, constitutional and private, and the alternative binary model through which constitutionalization is implemented. In contrast, German constitution, although it influences it, does not have the force for a full substitution for private law, whose rules fully retain their preeminence in the interpretive and decision-making sphere. The intensity and nature of this relationship are, however, reversed in the absence of state action. In USA, the implementation of the Constitution is not recognized in the case and therefore has no effect. In Germany, on the other hand, the influence of the Constitution remains independently, thus shaping a model of a constitutionalization of private law that integrates an organic process of harmonization of the legal system as a whole. When we look at this phenomenon today, we have to admit that two principles are being superseded. With regard to the fundamental elements of the theory, modern constitution about the limitation of the efficacy of fundamental rights has superseded the limit of the exclusive efficacy of fundamental rights in the vertical relationship between the individual and the state. Now we have peacefully the extension of the interference of fundamental rights even at an horizontal level, and so at a relationship between private parties. The second is the theory of the so-called irradiation effect of fundamental rights that has been methodologically superseded and reformulated. If we want to go on and to have a look at how the system works today, it is possible to highlight at one end how doctrine and jurisprudence have developed a general and functional framework of fundamental rights, reflecting the hypothesis of application in the sense of a protection, okay? Prohibition of interference and the rights of defense. So the subject has not only the prohibition of interference in his fundamental rights, acknowledged constitutionally, but also has the right to ask for the defense and for the protection of the state in this sense. On the other hand, it is possible to highlight how doctrine and jurisprudence, so the interpreters, have broken down the methodological principle into two different logics: the logics of direct efficacy and the logic of indirect efficacy of the fundamental rights in private law. Direct efficacy sought to adhere to the vertical application model in accordance with the principle of a prohibition of interference, assuming so its recognition in relations between private subjects and postulating consequently an absolute protection of subjective situations when they reflect fundamental rights. But at a methodological level, however, such protection structurally presented the problem that it could not be exempted from the assessment of the individual case and the relative intensity of the possible violation, taking into account the relationship with the protection of possible alternative legal situations, even if conflicting, which were also rooted in the system of fundamental rights, the conflicts between fundamental rights. This required the recourse of, for example, to the principle of balancing with all the limits that such a recourse entails. The second hypothesis, or the indirect efficacy, Mittelbare Drittwiekung, on the other hand, recognizes a priori in general the centrality of the principle of private autonomy and self-responsibility in private law on the same basis as a fundamental rights. It is founded upon the Article 2 of the first absatz of the constitutional law, German constitutional law, which protects the principle of a free development of each individual's personality. This means that the basis for the interpreter to permanently and unavoidably adapt the concretization is recognized by two factors. The assumption of this fundamental right especially implies the self-determination of the individual in the legal world. And second, a relationship between subjects equally indued with the entitlement of fundamental rights. In the particular concrete situation, such rights may be in conflict with each other or between different forms of the same right. In any case, it is necessary for the interpreter to concretize and define the conflict. For this reason, the option arises of recognizing, on the other hand, in the general clauses, a medium, Mittelbare, of normal application, necessary for an efficacy that is only indirect on individual legal situations, within a relationship between them and the fundamental rights formulated in accordance with the concept of the theory of their mutual interaction. In addition to the hypothesis of a link of concretization between fundamental rights and general clauses, there is, disputing the exclusivity of such a link, the interpretation of certain rules which identify a concurrent area of reference for indirect efficacy in a protective function. For example, other medium of interference of fundamental rights in private law are paragraph 134 of the German Civil Code on the legal prohibitions, standouts which prescribes the nullity of a legal act that violates a legal prohibition unless there is a different provision in the law itself. Positioning a specific protection of fundamental rights in the activity and resorting to the sanction of nullity for the hypothesis of contrast with them. Let's think about the position of this norm in the labor law, for example. Another one is the paragraph 823, which provides for non-contractual liability in relation to a list of protected goods: life, physical integrity, health, freedom, property, or other implied by the open formula, another right, and the breadth of application it achieves. This should be another way, another medium, legal medium, by which the fundamental rights permeate private law. We have other, like, for example, paragraph 138 in the German Civil Code for the hypothesis of a contrast with boni mores, that is the good morals of English common law. So the consolidated prevalence of the latter methodology and direct efficacy, according to the paradigmatic formula drawn from a celebrated leading case, that is the Lute cases, establishes that in civil law, the content of fundamental rights is developed indirectly through private law relations, and that affects obligatory relations and can be realized by the judge by means of general clauses. A paradigmatic case of the modus interpretandi, the manner of interpretation, may be briefly focused here, taken up by the right of personality. In order to understand the question of the right of personality in its general form, the articulation of the type of subjective situation that have arisen firstly through a creative interpretation of a loophole in paragraph 823, and then through the conjunction also of another norm, that is the paragraph 253, which originally paragraph 847 has become after the reform enacted recently in 2002. The foundation of so-called general right of personality, Allgemeines Persönlichkeitsrecht, first took place in the 1954 Federal Court of Justice establishment. By establishing the link between the paragraph 1 and paragraph 2 of the Constitution and the paragraph 823 of German Civil Code. This made it possible to overcome the first obstacle, namely, given the preeminence of fundamental rights, to provide absolute protection for the right in question and no longer fragmented and limited to certain specific interests pertaining to personality. The right to personality was enshrined as violated by the publication in 1954 decision, was enshrined as violated by the publication in the press of a private letter sent to a newspaper, and became the recipient of a protection extended to the maximum expansion, and could be limited only in prominent cases with respect to an exclusive sphere contemplated as inviolable, cases in which must be special and justified by public or private reasons. In the orbit of conceptual foundation, the situation was narrowly defined in its relation to the object belonging to the concrete case. Any verbal expression of a certain and definite thought is an emanation of the personality of its author, even if the form by which it is expressed cannot be protected, for example, by copyright. He alone, the subject, is entitled to decide whether and what forms his thoughts may be communicated to the public, since only he understands them as a direct emanation of his will, provided they are attributable to him and he is alive. This well-known ruling identifies the activities that are considered harmful to the right in the specific context of an unauthorized publication of private recordings as unauthorized publications of private thought or modified by outsiders through additions, partial publications, whether the private or essential or incidental parts. In another decision in 1958, the same court ruled that the human personality is a concept that should be considered as already established, as an integral part of the fundamental values of the legal order, which stand above the legal order itself. In turn, it established that the normative content and its function are the protection of the intimate sphere of the personality, which represent the basis of a free and responsible individual self-determination, the infringement on which mainly results in so-called immaterial damage, which is manifested by the ensuing degeneration of the personality. Their protection is based directly on the directives descend from the fundamental rights contained in paragraph 1 and 2 of the Constitution. And this is linked to the rule in force at the time, as we have said, the paragraph 847. The court emphasized that the injury, deprivation of liberty by cases such as the one that under consideration on the basis of an interpretation technique that is the analogical syllogism. So the assumption was made that the harm to the peaceful exercise of the will, understood as harm to the exercise of freedom, was taken over, and on the other hand, the extension of this protection to internal freedom, now protected as an expression of the general right of a personality, was assumed. This is especially so in view of the fact that for compression of physical freedom, even for the deprivation of intellectual freedom, restitutive remedies are not possible, and the remedy of the restitutio in integrum is precluded.
Yes.
The interpretive development, I'm going to conclude, Doctor. So,
I'm so sorry.
The interpretive development has led to overcoming, this generic analogical syllogism, okay? This avoids the operating of a excludendum. This avoids that the stratification of the concept that damage to freedom in its extensive and too much abstract hypothesis ends up undermining its taxonomic efficiency in private law by recognizing without any limits ad libitum any kind of injury that can be assumed to such an abstract case. But in conclusion, the experience of the efficacy toward the third parties, horizontal efficacy of fundamental rights, emblematizes how the circulation of rules between different legal systems naturally extends to the interpretive and applicative models that implement the respective activity of jurisprudential foundation of the law, covering the same general relevance. In this sense, I thought it was appropriate to discuss it with you today. And thank you very much for your kind listening.
Thank you, Professor Salvatore Tolone Azzariti. We are really grateful for your kind deliverance and giving us very much a picture of legalities with regard to private law and civil law that is practiced, especially in multi-pluralistic societies where existence and essence are at crossroads to fight for dignity as well as for equality. I now invite Professor Dinesh Singh ji to kindly give your statements, if anything you would like to give as observation.
No, I wish to congratulate Professor Salvatore for such a scholarly presentation. You covered so many aspects, and I was amazed at the breadth of your inferences with German private law and all the other things that you mentioned. And it's an eye-opener for me. So I just wish to thank you for such a scholarly presentation. Presumably, we will have the proceedings at some stage, Professor Singh.
Pardon, sir?
Will
Yes.
we have proceedings on record somewhere?
Yes, sir. This session is completely recorded and we'll send you the replay.
Good. So then I will look forward to that, because it'll take me some time to digest what Professor Salvatore said. It was so wide, so deep, and so scholarly. Thank you.
Indeed, it was really totally based on his research analytical studies, that how difficult it is sometimes to find the intricate, subtle lines of private law versus civil law that is constitutionally framed by the governments and executed.
Yeah. I was totally unaware of the differences that exist between different countries. That is in Europe, in the Western world. That's amazing.
Yes, Professor Salvatore?
I will make it short, my intervention, by in extreme synthesis, just talk to judges, talk to interpreters.
Now let's invite Sarthak Roy.
Talk to judges, talk to interpreters. Stop talking to politics. These are the new sources of human rights in private law are the judges.
Right.
We live in a more complex world. We already have the tools. We have all the tools to be applied. Let's start talk to interpreters, to judges, to
right.
They are the one who can change the situation of the application.
I agree with you totally. I agree with you totally.
On the enforcement of human rights in everyday life, in every everyday aspect of our life.
Thank you.
In extreme synthesis, my work.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Sarthak, can you put in your remarks?
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Singh. Really, congratulations to both Professor Dinesh Singh and Professor Azzariti for their insightful and enlightening remarks. So I have a question, probably you both being senior members and someone who have dealt at depth with all these issues can answer. So we see that there is a constant conflict between various forms of human rights, both in the private law or as well as the private public sphere as well. And borrowing what Gandhi mentioned, and considering that some of my research into Gandhi's works have led me to understand better India's contributions towards UDHR, was his championing for the cause of fundamental duties, which somehow I feel has not really been taken up at large by the countries or on the international platform as much as human rights for that matter. So do you feel, it's a question to all of you, even probably Mr. Nair can also jump in. Do you feel that due to a lack of recognition of fundamental duties at the highest paradigm as much as fundamental rights or human rights, this constant tussle or this constant battle between achievement of human rights would always remain? Or would someday finally universal realization of human rights finally come true? So that's my question. Yeah.
I think Mr. Nair is most qualified to answer that.
Mr. Nair?
I love how Professor Singh just threw that question back at me.
No, I sincerely meant that. I sincerely meant that.
No, thank you, Dr. Singh. I'll try and put it along these lines. I'm not a legal expert, so everything that Professor Azzariti spoke about was, if it was eye-opening for Dr. Dinesh Singh, you can imagine it opened a whole new world for me. That really is fantastic. But here, Sarthak, this is what I will talk about in relation to duties. And I'll talk about it from a migrant perspective. Migrant workers in general, no matter where you migrate to, are constantly being informed of their duties and responsibilities, right? In a lot of cases, let me give you, and I want to put it in very practical context. Before a migrant worker leaves the country, they are given something called as pre-departure orientation. Okay, so I'm not talking legal along the lines of what Professor Azzariti was speaking about, but more from a practical policymaker's approach. They're given pre-departure orientation. The pre-departure orientation is to inform them of both their duties and responsibilities and their rights. You know when this orientation is given? This orientation is given to them just as the visa has been stuck on their passport. Most migrant workers are dying to get out there and make that first dollar or that first rupee to send back home to their families. At that point in time, do you think they're really interested in hearing what some policymaker somewhere is telling them about what their duties and responsibilities should be and what their rights are? At that moment, neither of these issues, rights and duties and responsibilities, are necessarily the priority in that migrant worker's perspective. Therefore, that conflict that you talk about should be resolved right at a very nascent stage. It is an issue that needs to be taken into consideration in educational perspectives. It is an issue that needs to be considered. We need to inform people about their rights and responsibilities, or rights and duties, over a cup of chai under a banyan tree just after a siesta, in an informal gathering. Because if we otherwise try to impose it on people, forget implementing their duties, they don't even necessarily understand what their respective duties are, and what their responsibilities are. So I would basically, from a very humanistic point of view, say that it is so important to be able to bring people up along the lines of what Dr. Singh said, bring people up right from their young age, right from their educational backgrounds, to give them an understanding of how these two elements are interlinked. Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you, Shabari, and thank you, Sarthak. And I'm very much thankful to Professor Dinesh Singh for giving your observations and inputs to enlighten and furthering this discussion. Now, last of all, I invite Professor Kamal Singh ji to please extend word of thanks.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this wonderful session you organized. Really wonderful. I really enjoyed it from beginning. And I'm thankful to Professor Dinesh Singh ji, Padma Shri, in this wonderful Human Rights Day session. And Honorable Professor Salvatore, we are really very much thankful for your kind presence and your kind word to all of us. We are really enlightened from you. And Mr. Sarthak Roy, thank you so much. You provided India's contribution towards human rights. This was amazing. And Professor Shabarinath Nair, we are really thankful for your aspects on human rights and topic equality and reducing inequalities, advancing human rights. So thank you so much, everyone, because you share your precious time with us. Although you are very busy personalities, we are very much thankful for your presence and your insightful talks to all of us. Thank you so much on the behalf of BNU University. And thank you all attendees who are in this Day Human Rights. I'm thankful to all of you. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you, ma'am. And over to you again, ma'am. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm in gratitude to all of you. And it's really heartening to be in contact with you, and hope you will be keeping in touch with us and would be visiting somehow to our tourist city Udaipur. Definitely, and please keep in touch. You have our phone numbers, and do take a round of our university also. Of course, sir has said that it's totally, completely in a normative structure, trying to be formative with regard to development and opportunities. Yes, but still, this COVID fear has taken the some kind of toll to our development, in sense like all tribal students, they don't come up to classes just because there's a kind of a fear that it can contaminate or may spread. So I think this kind of thin attendance we can also see online, because mostly they all shunt to and fro from their village to our area, because earlier they used to stay in this Udaipur city by hiring their whatever accommodation, but now they all shunt or they go back to their hometowns every day. So this kind of thin attendance has really has been really a proof for us that we all have to work a lot, and we really salute to Sarthak and Shabari as young aspirants, young workers, motivating us and coming to us. And we are very much again thankful to Professor Dinesh Singh ji, who as an experienced emeritus professor has blessed Sarthak and Shabari in their whatever they have given to us as deliverances. Thank you, sir, and thank you, Professor Salvatore, for joining us, and please keep in touch, all of you.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed it very much, and this was very enlightening for me. So hopefully I will be a wiser man after this session today. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very
sir.
much, everybody.
Yeah.
Thanks for the great moment. Thank you.
Thank you. Salute to all of you, and great hand of applause from all our institution, faculty and students, for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you soon.
Thank you, ma'am.